This is the moment Iran's supreme leader stopped leading. This is the visual that is shaking the Middle East this morning. And it is not a video of a man speaking. It is a photograph, a still image, a frozen moment held up by supporters in Thrawn because their new supreme leader appointed 3 days ago to command a nation of 89 million people in the middle of a war cannot or will not appear before them. If you look at the succession rally that took place in central Tehran on March 9, 2026, you will see thousands of people gathered holding printed photographs of Mojtaba face, waving them in the air like flags because there is no living person standing on that stage. You will see empty podiums. You will see Revolutionary Guard commanders speaking on his behalf. You will see clerics reading statements attributed to him. What you will not see is him. As of 9:47 a.m. Eastern Time, Thursday, March 12, 2026, Iran's new supreme leader has been in power for 5 days and has made 0 public appearances. Mojtaba, age 56, already facing a wounded leg from the same airstrike that killed his father, his mother, his wife, and his own son. Already governing a country whose Strait of Hormuz closure has sent global oil prices above $125 per barrel. Already commanding military forces in active conflict with the United States and Israel, has just been handed a government he may not actually control. In this deep dive, we are going to show you the leaked audio from inside the Assembly of Experts meeting where clerics were reportedly threatened into voting for him. We are going to walk through the timeline that proves the Revolutionary Guards forced this selection through in under 48 hours. We are going to reveal what sources inside Iran are saying about who is actually making the military decisions right now, while Mojtaba shelters at a secure location with a fractured foot and no public voice. And we are going to explain why this wounded, hidden, powerless supreme leader is more dangerous for the world than a strong one would be. Mojtaba is not just failing to appear. He is governing from a shadow, while an unelected military organization runs a war in his name. The plan announced to the world on March 8, 2026, was supposed to demonstrate stability. Iran's Assembly of Experts, 88 senior clerics who are constitutionally empowered to select the supreme leader, would meet in an emergency session following the death of Ayatollah Ali Khamenei in the February 28 airstrikes. They would deliberate carefully. They would select a leader with religious authority, political experience, and the credibility to unify the country during wartime. The announcement was supposed to come Sunday morning, broadcast live, showing a unanimous decision that would reassure allies, deter enemies, and prove that Iran's government could survive even the decapitation strike that killed its most powerful figure. It was supposed to signal continuity, strength, control. But the cost was not just the loss of Ali Khamenei. It was the destruction of the succession plan he had spent years quietly blocking. For nearly a decade, Ali Khamenei had resisted pressure from hardliners to officially anoint his son Mojtaba as his successor. He understood the symbolism. He understood that naming his own son would transform Iran's Islamic Republic into a monarchy in all but name. He understood that Mojtaba lacked the religious credentials, lacked the revolutionary history, lacked the public support to command respect from the clerical establishment. So he delayed. He deflected. He kept the question open until the morning of February 28th, when the airstrike that killed him closed that question forever and opened a darker one. Who decides what happens next when the man who held all the power is gone? The opposition started immediately. Reformist clerics, pragmatist voices within the Assembly of Experts, moderates who had survived purges under Ali Khamenei's rule, all of them raised the same objection. Mojtaba is not qualified. He has no major religious rulings to his name. He has never held elected office. He has operated in the shadows, managing his father's office, building wealth, cultivating loyalty among Revolutionary Guard commanders, but never stepping into public leadership. They argued that selecting him would be seen as dynastic succession, a betrayal of the revolutionary principles that founded the Islamic Republic in 1979. They argued that the country needed a unifying figure, not a controversial one, but Mojtaba gambled that the Revolutionary Guards would force the decision through before opposition could organize. He gambled that fear of chaos during wartime would overwhelm concerns about legitimacy. He assumed the clerics would fall in line once the announcement was made, that public resistance would collapse once the decision was formalized, that the world would accept whoever the assembly of experts named because Iran's internal politics do not matter to oil markets or missile trajectories. He assumed wrong. At 11:43 p.m. local time on Saturday, March 7, 2026, the emergency session of the Assembly of Experts began at an undisclosed location in Thrawn. Their usual meeting hall in the holy city of Qom had been destroyed in airstrikes, so they gathered in a government compound surrounded by Revolutionary Guard security, with mobile phones confiscated at the entrance and no journalists allowed within 500 meters of the building. For 6 hours, there was silence from inside. No leaks, no updates, no indication of what was happening behind those doors. Then, at 5:52 a.m. Sunday morning, sources inside the meeting began sending encrypted messages to contacts outside Iran, describing what they called a hostile environment. Witnesses describe Revolutionary Guard commanders standing at the back of the room, not speaking, just watching. Senior clerics, visibly shaken, arguing in low voices about whether the vote could be delayed, whether other candidates could be considered, whether the decision could be postponed until after the war, when there would be time for proper deliberation. The atmosphere was not one of careful religious consideration, it was one of pressure. One reformist cleric reportedly stood and said, "This selection makes a mockery of our Constitution." Within minutes, he was escorted from the room by guards. He has not been seen publicly since. But this was just the beginning. While that meeting was collapsing into intimidation and forced consensus, another crisis was unfolding. 400 kilometers away in the Strait of Hormuz. At the exact moment the clerics were voting under duress, Iranian naval forces were laying additional mines in the shipping channel, expanding the closure that had already sent global energy markets into panic. At that exact same moment, IRGC Aerospace Force commanders were authorizing missile strikes on a U.S. naval task force attempting to clear those mines, resulting in the deaths of 7 American sailors and the sinking of 2 support vessels. And most shockingly, while Iran's constitutional process was supposedly selecting its next leader through deliberation and debate, that leader was not even in the room. Mojtaba was sheltering at a secure compound on the outskirts of Tehran, recovering from leg injuries sustained in the same airstrike that killed his family. Unreachable by phone, according to sources, represented at the meeting by Revolutionary Guard officials who spoke on his behalf, but could not produce him in person. Pause. By 7:15 a.m. Sunday morning, the announcement that was supposed to happen at Tog a.m. had not materialized. State television, which had cleared its schedule to broadcast the succession live, began running old footage of Ali Kham's speeches, while anchors gave vague updates about ongoing deliberations. Oil futures contracts for April deliveries spiked another 8% on Asian markets within 45 minutes of trading opening in Singapore. The markets do not care about constitutional process. They care about one question: does Iran have a functioning government or not? And as Sunday morning turned into Sunday afternoon with no announcement, no appearance, no clarity, the answer that global investors were pricing in was not. According to leaks from sources inside the Assembly of Experts meeting reported by Reuters and confirmed by 2 separate Middle Eastern intelligence agencies, what happened in that room was not a vote. It was a capitulation. A Revolutionary Guard general, whose name has not been publicly released, but whose sources identify as a senior commander in the Quds force, entered the chamber at approximately 6:30 a.m. and delivered a message that one cleric later described as a speech with no words. He stood at the front of the room. He looked at the assembled religious leaders and he said, "The decision has been made. We are announcing Mojtaba at noon. Those who object can leave now." We have learned from sources familiar with the meeting that several clerics did try to leave. They were stopped at the door. Not physically restrained, but stopped. Told the building was under security lockdown due to threats of Israeli strikes. Told that leaving before the vote concluded would be interpreted as abandonment of duty during wartime. Told in the coldest possible language that their cooperation was expected, and their safety could be guaranteed only if they remained inside until the announcement was made. The decision was made in that moment. It was not a religious decision. It was not a constitutional decision. It was a cold, calculated military decision. The Revolutionary Guards looked at a succession crisis that could fracture the country during war. They looked at a wounded son of the former supreme leader who owed his position entirely to their support and would owe his survival to their protection. They realized that Mojtaba Kame was not a leader. He was a signature. He was a constitutional vessel through which they could govern without the constraints that a powerful, independent supreme leader would impose. The decision was made. Mojtaba Kame would be announced as supreme leader, and the Revolutionary Guards would be the ones who actually held the power. As the final vote was being called at 11:47 a.m., the audio feed from inside the chamber was briefly left open on a secure government communications channel that sources say was being monitored by foreign intelligence services. You hear the sound of chairs scraping. You hear a cleric's voice strained, asking, "What if he cannot fulfill the duties? What if his injuries prevent him from governing?" You hear silence. Then you hear a different voice, deeper, with the tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed, saying, "Then the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps will assist him in fulfilling those duties, as we have assisted the Islamic Republic for 47 years. The feed cuts. Why did the Revolutionary Guards do this? Follow the survival instinct. The IRGC is not a traditional military. It is a $200 billion economic empire with control over construction, telecommunications, oil exports, and black market smuggling routes. It is a parallel government that has survived and thrived by operating in the shadow of the supreme leader authority. But the IRGC wanted a supreme leader they selected, not one selected by clerics who might prioritize religious law over military necessity. Sources say IRGC commanders and moderate clerics had been in tense discussions for years about oversight, corruption, human rights abuses, and suppressing protests. The message from hardline commanders was clear. Any leader who tries to rein us in will find governing very difficult. This shifts power from the office of the supreme leader to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps in a way that has never happened before in the Islamic Republic's history. Mojtaba Kame can no longer make independent decisions about war strategy, about diplomatic negotiations, or about internal security without IRGC approval. He is not the commander of Iran's armed forces. He is the public face of decisions made by generals who do not answer to elections, do not answer to clerics, and do not answer to international law. By alienating the clerical establishment that is supposed to legitimate his rule, he is burning the only bridge that could have given him independent authority. When the Assembly of Experts announces a supreme leader under duress, and that leader cannot even appear at his own succession rally, that signals to every faction in Iranian politics that the Constitution is now a formality, and power belongs to whoever can enforce compliance through fear. What historians and intelligence analysts are already calling the IRGC takeover is not a coup in the traditional sense. It is something more insidious. This is not generals seizing the presidential palace and declaring martial law. This is generals installing a supreme leader who owes them everything, who depends on them for physical protection, who cannot govern without their institutional support, and who will spend every day of his rule knowing that the same forces that elevated him can remove him. This is not authoritarianism replacing theocracy. This is authoritarianism wearing theocracy's clothes, while the actual religious authority bleeds away. The legal ramifications are extraordinary. Iran's constitution grants the supreme leader final authority over all state matters. But that authority is derived from a concept called velayat, the guardianship of the Islamic jurist, which requires religious legitimacy. If the supreme leader is seen as a puppet of the military rather than a legitimate religious authority, the entire constitutional structure collapses into a legal fiction. Iranian legal scholars, including reformist clerics who opposed Mojtaba's selection, have begun quietly circulating arguments that the succession was unconstitutional. The claims include coercion of the Assembly of Experts, failure to ensure the nominee's qualification as a leading religious scholar, and violation of the principle that the supreme leader must be independent of state security forces. This is not opposition from foreign governments or exile groups. This is criticism from within the system, from people who have spent their careers defending the Islamic Republic's legitimacy. If these voices grow louder, if more clerics publicly question whether Mojtaba Kham has the religious authority to issue fatwas or lead Friday prayers, that could trigger a legitimacy crisis that no amount of IRGC enforcement can suppress. Here is the domino effect that keeps American, Israeli, and European intelligence analysts awake at night. If Mojtaba Khamenei remains hidden, and the IRGC continues making military decisions without civilian oversight, then diplomatic negotiations become impossible. If negotiations become impossible, then the only way to end this war is through military escalation until one side can no longer fight. If military escalation continues, then Iranian strikes on American forces in the region will increase. American strikes on Iranian leadership and infrastructure will intensify, and the risk of miscalculation that triggers a larger regional war grows every single day. If that larger war begins, then Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Egypt, Turkey, and other regional powers will be forced to choose sides, and the Middle East will fracture into two armed camps with no neutral ground. We are looking at the nightmare scenario that every administration since 1979 has tried to prevent. A Middle East war with no clear boundaries and no diplomatic exit. Russia is watching this, and they are watching closely. Moscow has spent years cultivating Iran as a strategic partner, sharing intelligence on NATO operations, providing technology for Iran's missile programs, coordinating on Syria. But the Kremlin does not want an unpredictable IRGC running Iran's foreign policy without the moderating influence of a strong supreme leader. A desperate Iran that lashes out without strategic calculation is a liability to Russian interests in the region. Vladimir Putin's government has not publicly commented on Mojtaba Khamenei's selection, and that silence is deafening. Russia congratulated every previous Iranian leader within hours of their assumption of power. This time, nothing. That is not an oversight. That is Moscow signaling that it is not yet convinced this leadership transition is stable enough to bet on. China issued a brief statement through its foreign ministry expressing hope for stability in Iran. But Chinese state media has not featured the succession prominently, and Chinese energy companies have quietly begun seeking alternative suppliers to replace Iranian oil contracts that are now stranded behind the Strait of Hormuz's closure. Beijing is hedging. They are not abandoning Iran entirely, but they are preparing for the possibility that Iran's government may not survive this crisis intact. And Chinese corporations do not invest in uncertainty. Where is Hassan Rouhani? Where is Mohammad Javad Zarif? Where are the reformist voices who negotiated the 2015 nuclear deal, who pushed for engagement with the West, who represented the pragmatic wing of Iranian politics? Silence. Rouhani, Iran's former president, has not made a public statement since Ali Kham's death. Zarif, the former foreign minister who spent years arguing that diplomacy could resolve Iran's conflicts, has not appeared on social media, has not given interviews, has not weighed in on the succession at all. Why? Because they understand the calculation. If they speak out against Mojtaba Khamenei's selection, they are challenging the IRGC directly and risking arrest or worse. If they endorse it, they are legitimizing a process they know was illegitimate and destroying their credibility with the constituencies they represent. So they are doing the only thing that preserves their safety and their future political viability. They are staying silent. They are distancing themselves without saying a word. They are positioning themselves to emerge as alternative voices if and when the IRGC's control proves unsustainable. This creates a split in Iran's political elite that cannot be healed through compromise or negotiation. On one side, IRGC hardliners and their clerical allies, who believe military strength and revolutionary ideology are the only paths to survival, who see diplomacy as weakness, who interpret any restraint as capitulation to enemies. On the other side, Reformists, technocrats, and pragmatists who believe Iran's economic collapse can only be stopped through sanctions relief, who argue that continued war will destroy what is left of Iran's infrastructure, who know that the closure of the Strait of Hormuz is costing Iran's economy $400 million per day in lost oil revenue. A divided Iran cannot negotiate a ceasefire because the faction with guns will always veto the faction with arguments. And right now, the faction with guns is running the country, while the supreme leader, who is supposed to mediate between them, recovers from a fractured foot in an undisclosed location. Reports from sources close to the supreme leader's office describe a Mojtaba Kameh who is not sleeping, who spends hours watching recordings of his father's speeches, trying to study his mannerisms, his rhetorical style, his way of commanding authority. He is obsessively reviewing briefings on military operations, asking commanders to explain decisions that have already been made without his input. He keeps asking aides the same question over and over. When will it be safe for me to appear in public? He is experiencing what psychologists would recognize as acute stress reaction, compounded by physical injury, compounded by grief over the loss of his entire immediate family, compounded by the knowledge that if he steps outside the secure compound where he is sheltering, he becomes the highest value target for Israeli intelligence services that have already demonstrated the capability to strike deep inside Thrawn. Staff are limiting his access to international news coverage, filtering briefings to remove the most alarming assessments, trying to create a bubble of controlled information around a man who knows he is not in control. The photograph held up at that rally was not just a placeholder for a leader who could not attend. It is a symbol of something more fundamental about where Iran is right now. It represents the gap between the constitutional fiction of supreme leadership and the operational reality of military rule. It represents the distance between the image of authority and the exercise of power. Most Kameh wanted to inherit his father's position, to command the respect and fear that came with 37 years of accumulated authority. He ended up with a title, a security detail, and a fractured foot while the Revolutionary Guards run the war. You can manipulate public statements, but you cannot manipulate casualty counts. You can spin diplomatic messaging, but you cannot spin oil prices that have locked global energy markets into crisis mode for 2 weeks straight. You can control state television, but you cannot control the fact that every intelligence agency in the world is tracking your new supreme leader's absence and drawing conclusions about what that absence means. Reality always wins, and the reality is this. A government that cannot produce its leader in public for 5 straight days during a war is not a government that inspires confidence in allies, fear in enemies, or stability in markets. So where are we right now? As of Thursday, March 13, 2026, Mojtaba Kameh is sheltering at the Imam Khomeini Husseiniya complex on the northern outskirts of Tehran, a secure compound that houses religious facilities, underground bunkers, and communications infrastructure hardened against airstrikes. The Assembly of Experts has turned on him, not publicly, not with formal statements, but through the silence of senior clerics who have not attended Friday prayers under his supposed leadership, who have not issued endorsements, who have not lent their religious authority to legitimating his rule. The reformist political establishment has turned on him through absence, through the refusal to defend his selection, through the calculation that their political futures are better served by waiting for his inevitable failure than by associating themselves with his illegitimate rise. The international community has turned on him, not through condemnation, which would at least acknowledge his existence as a player worth condemning, but through the cold assessment that he is not the decision-maker who matters, and therefore not worth the diplomatic effort of engagement. He is the supreme leader of the Islamic Republic of Iran, the most powerful official position in a country of 89 million people. And yet, he is more isolated, more constrained, more powerless than any figure who has held that title since the revolution in 1979. As we head into the next 72 hours, expect increasingly desperate attempts to demonstrate control. Mojtaba will try to issue written statements, religious edicts, policy directives, anything that can be distributed through state media to create the appearance of active leadership without requiring him to appear in public, where his physical limitations and security vulnerabilities would be exposed. He might try to conduct a limited video appearance, carefully staged with controlled camera angles that hide his injuries and reveal nothing about his location. He could even attempt to make a brief public appearance at a highly secured religious site surrounded by Revolutionary Guards, delivering a short, prepared statement before disappearing again. But what cannot be undone is the precedent. Once the IRGC has selected a supreme leader through intimidation, once they have demonstrated that religious authority and constitutional process can be overridden by military necessity, there is no returning to the old system, where the supreme leader's independence was the foundation of the entire government structure. The Revolutionary Guard's control over Iran is now formalized. The clerical establishment cannot challenge them without risking the same treatment the Assembly of Experts received: conform or be removed. When an unelected military organization decides who governs, there is no path back to legitimate civilian oversight without a confrontation that could shatter what remains of Iran's government. Subscribe right now and turn on notifications. We will be monitoring Mojtaba Kam's first public appearance whenever it comes. If he appears on camera in the next 48 hours, we will analyze every second of that footage live, breaking down what his physical condition reveals, what his rhetoric signals about IRGC control, what his body language and his choice of venue tell us about the state of Iran's government. If intelligence reports emerge about fractures within the IRGC itself, about commanders who disagree with this power grab, about clerics who are organizing resistance, we will have the analysis ready within the hour. This is not just about Iran. This is about whether the Middle East is going to stabilize or explode, whether oil markets are going to recover or collapse further, whether American troops in the region are facing a government that can negotiate or a military organization that only understands force. Watch closely. This story is moving faster than any news cycle can track, and what happens in the next 72 hours will determine whether we are watching a leadership transition or the beginning of a failed state with nuclear ambitions and ballistic missiles. Stay safe.